are several different types of factoring techniques. The first one, the basic one, GCF, or greatest common factor. If there's a common term like a, you can take out of both expressions, you can factor and write the rest in parentheses. Difference of squares. If you have two terms, so they're perfect squares, you can take the square root of. The factor would be two parentheses, a plus b and a minus b. New to Algebra 2, difference of cubes, a cubed minus b cubed. If you can take the cube root of each term, the first parentheses would be a minus b, and the second parentheses is a trinomial. We'll have a squared, and then positive a times b, and then plus b squared. Difference of cubes, we'll have a minus b at the beginning, and the middle term will be a times b positive. Sum of cubes is similar to difference of cubes, but it's the addition of two perfect cubes. Again, taking the cube root, we'll have a plus b for the first parentheses. The second parentheses, the trinomial, is exactly the same as the difference of cubes. The only difference is you have minus ab instead of plus ab. Perfect square trinomials. If you have a perfect square trinomial with a squared and b squared, and the middle term is either positive 2ab or minus 2ab, you can factor that into one factor squared, either a plus b or a minus b. And the last term, grouping. Factor by grouping is when you have four terms. We'll factor the first term using greatest common factor, taking out the common term, in this case x, and the last two terms will take out the common term, in this case it's y. When you do factor by grouping, both of the two parentheses left over should match up, and your terms outside, x plus y, will be your first parentheses, and the parentheses that matched up is your second factor, a plus b. Title of the first section today is factor. First question, 6x squared y squared minus 2x y squared plus 6x cubed y. When factoring, you can look back at the formulas or think about different ways to factor. The most basic way to factor, though, when you have numbers in common, is the greatest common factor. Looking at the coefficients, 6, 2, and 6, we can take out a common factor of 2 for the coefficients. Each term also has the variable x, so we can take out a single x, and each term also has a single y, so we can take out a single y. We can only take out a single x since the second term only has x, and we can only take out a single y since the last term only has y. Factoring from here, we'll take 2xy or divide each term by 2xy. So the first term will be left with 3. Factoring out an x and a y, we'll have 3xy. Second term minus. Factoring the 2 out, we'll still be left with the negative. Factoring the x out, we'll have no more x's. We'll have y squared. Factoring out a y, we'll have a single y left. And the last term, 6, we're factoring out a 2, so we'll be left with 3. Taking out a single x from the x cubed, we'll have x squared. And taking the y out, we won't have y's in our last term. So always a good idea to double check after you factor, see if there's any other terms you can factor out or use any other factor techniques. In this case you cannot. So our final answer is 2xy times 3xy minus y plus 3x squared. Second question is x squared minus 9. Factor in this term, there's no common terms to take out, but this term does match up with one of our factoring techniques, difference of squares. We can take the square root of x and also the square root of 9. Whenever you have the difference of squares, we'll have two binomials for answer. Square root of x squared would be x, square root of 9 would be 3, and for difference of squares, we'll make one factor a positive and the other factor a negative. So we'll have x plus 3 and x minus 3. And last term we'll factor for the section, x squared plus 8x plus 16. If you wanted to, you could factor this using the diamond method, but this also matches up with one of our factoring techniques. If we have x squared, that's a perfect square. 16 is a perfect square. And if you take the x and the 4 and you double that, we'll have 2ab in the middle, which matches up with a perfect square trinomial. So if you recognize this is a perfect square trinomial, we can write it as x plus 4 squared. But again, you could also factor this using the diamond method and come up with the same answer. Title of the last section today is More Factoring. In this section, we'll continue factoring and using the factoring techniques. First question is a cubed minus 4a squared plus 3a minus 12. Looking at this term, there is no greatest common factor to factor out. When you see four terms usually means you can factor by grouping. To factor by grouping, we'll look at the first two terms and then look at the second two terms. Factoring the first two terms, we can take out the greatest common factor. Both of these have a's, and they also have at least two a's, so we can factor out a squared. Factoring out a squared just from the first two terms, we'll be left with a minus 4. Factoring the last two terms, 3a minus 2, the greatest common factor would be 3 or positive 3. And factoring a 3 out from each of those two terms, we'll be left with a minus 4. When factoring by grouping, again, the parentheses must match up, a minus 4 and a minus 4. If they don't match up, you have to use a different factoring technique or go back and check your work. When the parentheses do match up, the terms outside, a squared and 3, will be one of the factors, a squared plus 3, and the parentheses that do match up is our second factor, which is a minus 4. You can always check the parentheses at the end, make sure there's no other common factors to take out. Next question is c cubed d cubed plus 27. Looking at this question, we have a cubed exponents, which leads us to look at the difference of cubes or sum of cubes. Since we're adding, this will be the sum of cubes, since we can take the cube root of c and d, and we can also take the cube root of 27. To factor this, it's a good idea to take the cube root of each of these. C cubed would just be c, and d cubed would be d. 27, the cube root is the number times itself 3 times, that's 27. And that number would be 3, since 3 cubed would be 27. Once we have the cube root of each term, we can fill in using the formula for sum of cubes, where this will be a and this will be b. The first parentheses is just the terms cd and 3, and we'll keep the plus sign from the sum of cubes. So we'll have cd plus 3. The second parentheses will be a trinomial. The first term is cd, but we'll square cd, so this will be c squared and d squared. The second term will actually have a minus sign. When you have the sum of cubes, the second term in the trinomial will be minus, and we'll put both the terms together, cd times 3, which will be 3cd. And last term for the trinomial, we'll take the last term that we took the cube root of, which is 3, and we'll square the 3, so our last term would be 9. So our final answer for sum of cubes is cd plus 3 and c squared d squared minus 3cd plus 9. And last question for the section. 2x squared minus x minus 21. Factoring this expression, you can look at the factoring techniques that we did, but there's no common factors, there's no perfect squares, so none of the factoring techniques that we've written down today will factor this expression. What we can do though is use the diamond method to factor. Anytime you have a trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c, you can use the diamond method to see if the expression factors. The difference on this expression is we have a coefficient in front of the x squared. So when we do the diamond method, the number on top, instead of negative 21, we'll actually multiply negative 21 times the coefficient. So we'll have negative 42 on top of the diamond method. And the number on the bottom would be negative 1. From here, we can factor like normal. Again, we want to find two numbers that multiply to get the top number, negative 42, and those same two numbers have to add to get negative 1. Those numbers would be negative 7 and positive 6. Negative 7 times 6 is negative 42, and negative 7 plus 6 is negative 1. Another difference when factoring when you have a coefficient, instead of the answers x minus 7 and x plus 6, because that would not get us 2x squared when you FOIL, what we'll do is rewrite the original question 2x squared, but instead of negative x, we'll split up negative x using these two numbers, negative 7x and plus 6x. By using these two numbers, it's still equal to negative x. Negative 7x plus 6x would be negative 1x. But now we have two terms in the middle, and we can add the negative 21 on the end. So we have 4 terms altogether. When we have 4 terms, we can factor by grouping. Factor by grouping from here, the common term in the first two will have x. Taking the x out of each of these, we'll be left with 2x minus 7. Factoring the last two terms, we can take out a positive 3, and we'll be left with 2x minus 7. Again, factoring by grouping, the parentheses should match up, and your first parentheses you can write the terms outside, x plus 3, and the second factor, as long as the parentheses match up, our second factor is 2x minus 7. So our final answer, x plus 3 and 2x minus 7.